On the morning of September 14, 1862, in Marblehead, a small fishing village along the Massachusetts coast, two black children sat across from a white doctor who had journeyed nearly 40 miles from Boston just to see them. The doctor's name was Nathaniel Warren, a 53-year-old who had devoted his entire career to studying the human mind at Harvard Medical School. He'd examined hundreds of patients, published papers in medical journals across America and Europe, and witnessed things most people would never believe. But he had never encountered anything quite like the Carter twins. The children were 8 years old, named Elijah and Ruth. They remained perfectly still in their wooden chairs, hands folded in their laps, their dark eyes fixed on the doctor with an intensity that unsettled him. They didn't fidget or glance away. They simply observed as though they were the ones conducting the examination. Dr. Warren opened his leather bag and pulled out a set of cards, each featuring a different math problem. He designed them himself, arranged in order of increasing difficulty, starting with simple addition and culminating in calculations that would challenge most university professors even with pen and paper. He handed the first card to Elijah. "Tell me the answer," Dr. Warren said. Elijah barely glanced at it. 23, he replied. "Correct." The doctor handed him the second card, and Elijah answered before his hand had fully withdrawn. 57, again, correct. They moved through the cards one by one, the problems growing more intricate with each step. Addition gave way to subtraction, then multiplication, then division, eventually branching into multi-operation, multi-step equations. Elijah answered every single one without pause, hesitation, or a single mistake. When they reached the final card, a problem doctor, Warren himself had needed nearly 3 minutes to solve when he created it. Elijah studied the numbers for maybe 2 seconds. 439, he said. Dr. Warren stared at the boy, checked his answer key once, then again. "That's correct," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Then he turned to Ruth and took out a different set of materials. These weren't math problems, but pages of text from books Dr. Warren had chosen specifically because they'd be unfamiliar to any child. A passage from a Latin medical textbook, a segment from a legal document filled with archaic terms, and an excerpt from a philosophical treatise with vocabulary far beyond what an 8-year-old might comprehend. He handed her the Latin text. "Read this," he instructed. Ruth looked at the page. She didn't know Latin. She'd never studied it, had never even seen Latin text before. But as she studied the words, something happened. She began sounding them out slowly at first, then with growing confidence. Her pronunciation wasn't flawless, but it was recognizable. Even more remarkable, after each sentence, she paused and guessed at its meaning based on the patterns she was noticing. Several guesses correct. Dr. Warren leaned back in his chair, hands trembling. In 3 decades of practice, he'd never witnessed anything like this. He'd heard rumors of children with extraordinary mental abilities, but always dismissed them as exaggeration or fraud. This was neither. He looked at the twins' mother, Sarah Carter, standing in the corner of the small room with an expression mixing pride and fear. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "how long have your children been able to do these things?" Sarah Carter was 31 years old, born free in Massachusetts to a black sailor and a Native American woman. She'd worked as a domestic servant most of her life, cleaning homes and doing laundry for white families who paid her barely enough to survive. She'd known her children were different since they were 3. That was when Elijah started counting everything he saw, adding and multiplying numbers from daily life, calculating sums she couldn't verify. That was when Ruth began memorizing entire books after hearing them read aloud just once, reciting passages word for word weeks or months later. Sarah had tried to hide their abilities. She understood in a way no white person could fully grasp how dangerous it was for black children to appear too intelligent in America. In 1862, the country was at war. The Civil War had begun in April 1861, and 18 months later, fighting raged on. President Abraham Lincoln hadn't yet issued the Emancipation Proclamation. In the South, 4 million black people remained enslaved. In the North, free black people lived precariously, tolerated but not accepted, free but not equal. A black child who could read was dangerous. A black child who could outthink white adults was unthinkable. Sarah kept her children's abilities secret for 5 years, telling them repeatedly they must never show what they could do, must pretend to be ordinary, must hide their gifts. But secrets have a way of escaping. 3 weeks before Dr. Warren's visit, a white merchant named Thomas Aldrich arrived at Sarah's small house to deliver fabric she'd ordered for sewing. While she was in the back counting coins to pay him, he noticed Elijah at the kitchen table staring at a newspaper someone had left behind. The merchant laughed condescendingly. "Can you even read that, boy?" Elijah looked up. "Yes," he said. "And there's an error in the 3rd paragraph. The reporter wrote that Union forces captured 300 Confederate soldiers at the Battle of Antietam. But if you calculate based on the numbers given earlier in the article, the correct figure should be 347. Thomas Aldrich stared at the boy, picked up the paper, read the 3rd paragraph, did the math. The boy was right. He left without another word, but within days the story spread through Marblehead. The Black Widow's children could read, could calculate, had minds that seemed impossible to explain. Dr. Warren heard it from a colleague who heard it from a patient who heard it from a neighbor. At first, he dismissed it as rumor, but something nagged at him, made him unable to let go. So he made the journey to Marblehead, and now sat across from 2 children who'd just demonstrated abilities challenging everything he thought he knew about the human mind. "Mrs. Carter," he said again, "I must know. How long have they been able to do this, and how is it possible?" Sarah Carter looked at her children, then at the doctor. She knew whatever she said next would change their lives forever. "They've always been this way," she said. "Since before they could walk, before they could talk. They see things others can't, understand things others can't. I don't know why or how, I only know it's true, Doctor." Warren nodded slowly, already composing the letter he'd write to colleagues at Harvard, already imagining the examinations, papers, and lectures. He didn't notice the fear in Sarah Carter's eyes. He didn't understand he was about to make her children visible in a world that punished black people for being seen. News of the Carter twins spread faster than Sarah feared. Within a week of Dr. Warren's visit, 3 more doctors came to Marblehead to examine them. Within 2 weeks, a reporter from the Boston Evening Transcript arrived with questions and notes. Within a month, the story appeared in newspapers across New England. Headlines varied in tone. The Boston Evening Transcript ran a piece titled, "Remarkable Negro Children Display Unusual Mental Faculties," cautiously admiring but careful not to suggest racial equality. The Springfield Republican published a different angle, "Scientific Mystery. How can such minds exist in such bodies?" treating the twins as curiosities, specimens to study. The Providence Journal went further with nature's impossibility made manifest, suggesting the twins' abilities must stem from some unknown biological anomaly, a freak occurrence proving nothing about the general capacities of the Negro race. But other reactions emerged too. The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper in Boston run by William Lloyd Garrison, ran a front-page story headlined simply "Proof of Human Equality," arguing the Carter twins demonstrated what abolitionists had always claimed. Mental differences between races stemmed from circumstance and education, not inherent biological inferiority. That article changed everything. William Lloyd Garrison, one of America's most famous abolitionists, had been publishing The Liberator since 1831, and his newspaper was read by anti-slavery activists across the country and worldwide. When he wrote about the Carter twins, people paid attention. Donations began arriving at Sarah Carter's small house. Letters came from strangers wanting to help. Offers of education arrived from schools and tutors willing to teach the children for free. Invitations came from churches and lecture halls wanting the twins to appear. But other things arrived too. threats in the mail, anonymous letters warning Sarah her children would be harmed if they kept attracting attention. Rocks were thrown through her windows at night. A dead cat was left on her doorstep with a note, "Only know your place." The people of Marblehead, who'd lived alongside Sarah for years, began treating her differently. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. Customers who'd hired her for sewing and laundry found other seamstresses. The white families who'd employed her as a domestic servant let her go one by one until she had no income. Sarah understood what was happening. Her children's intelligence had upset the natural order. White people in Marblehead had tolerated a black family among them as long as they remained inferior, dependent, subservient. But the twins' abilities hinted at something they couldn't accept, the possibility that black minds equaled white minds. That possibility threatened the entire justification for slavery, challenged the structure of American society, made white people question teachings from birth. So they responded the only way they knew. They tried to destroy what they couldn't understand. In November 1862, Sarah Carter made a heart-wrenching decision. She sent her children away. Dr. Warren had arranged for the twins to enroll at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia, founded in 1837 by a Quaker named Richard Humphreys, one of the few institutions in America providing advanced education to black students. The school agreed to accept Elijah and Ruth on full scholarship, with room and board provided by a wealthy abolitionist family. Sarah couldn't go with them. She had no money for the journey, no way to support herself in Philadelphia, and knew leaving Marblehead would cost her everything. The small house she rented, the few possessions she owned, the fragile stability she'd fought for. So she said goodbye at Marblehead Harbor on a cold November morning. She held them both against her chest and whispered things she'd never said before. "You're special," she said, "not because of what you can do with your minds. You're special because you're my children, because you're good and kind and strong, because you've survived in a world that didn't want you to survive." She pulled back, memorizing every detail. "The world will try to use you. White people will want to parade you before audiences, study you like animals, prove their theories about race one way or another using your minds as evidence." She took their hands. "Don't let them. You're not evidence, not specimens, not proof of anything except your own existence. You're human beings deserving to be treated as such. Anyone who treats you as anything doesn't deserve your cooperation." Elijah and Ruth boarded the ship to Philadelphia. They stood at the railing watching their mother grow smaller until she disappeared. They didn't cry. In their 8 years, they'd learned crying didn't change anything. They simply watched and remembered. The Institute for Colored Youth sat on Lombard Street in Philadelphia, in a neighborhood home to free black people for generations. The three-story brick building, once a warehouse, had classrooms carved out of open spaces, furnished with donated desks and chairs, lined with shelves of books collected over decades. When Elijah and Ruth arrived in December 1862, about 120 students attended, ranging from 6 to 22 years old, most children of free black families in Philadelphia. A few escaped slaves who'd come north via the Underground Railroad. All were there for the same reason: an education the white world didn't want them to have. The principal, Ebenezer Bassett, was 38 years old, a graduate of Connecticut State Normal School and one of the first black Americans to receive a college education. He'd led the institute since 1857, and under him it became one of the finest black educational institutions in the country. When Mr. Bassett first met the Carter twins, he tested them, but differently than Dr. Warren. He didn't care about calculations or memory tricks. He cared about understanding. He sat with them in his office and asked questions about the world. "Why do you think there's a war happening in this country?" he asked. Elijah and Ruth exchanged a glance. Over the years, they'd learned to communicate without speaking, a look conveying entire conversations. Ruth answered first. "Because people believe things that aren't true," she said. "They believe some people are worth more than others. that skin color tells you something about the mind. They believe these things because believing makes it easier to do terrible things without guilt. She paused. The war is about slavery, but slavery's about belief. If people stopped believing black people were inferior, slavery couldn't exist. The war is really about what people believe. Mr. Bassett sat back. He'd taught for nearly a decade, encountered many bright students, but never heard an 8-year-old speak with such clarity on such complex matters. "And you, Elijah?" he asked. Elijah considered carefully. "I think my sister's right," he said, "but I think there's something else too. The war's also about money. Slave owners are rich because they don't pay for labor. If slavery ends, they lose their money, and people do almost anything to keep their money." He looked at Mr. Bassett with those intense dark eyes. "I think the war won't end until one side has no money left to fight. And I think many people will die before that happens." Mr. Bassett nodded slowly. He understood now why Dr. Warren was so astonished. These children didn't just have powerful minds, they had powerful understanding, seeing the world with a clarity most adults never achieved. But he also understood something Dr. Warren hadn't. These children were in danger. Their intelligence made them valuable to those who'd use them, and threatening to those who'd maintain the existing order. They'd be sought and hunted, celebrated and despised, never allowed to simply live in peace. Mr. Bassett decided then to protect them, educate them, prepare them for the world they'd face, and teach them something no one else could: how to survive. The years at the Institute transformed Elijah and Ruth. They studied mathematics with Octavius Cato, a young black man who'd become a prominent civil rights activist in Philadelphia. They studied literature with Fannie Jackson, who'd become the first black woman to lead an institution of higher education in America. They studied science, history, languages, and philosophy with some of the finest black educators of their generation. But more importantly, they learned to control their gifts. Mr. Bassett understood raw intelligence displayed without wisdom could be dangerous. He'd seen bright young black men and women destroyed by white jealousy, their talents making them targets rather than assets. He knew Elijah and Ruth would need more than intellectual ability to survive. They'd need judgment, restraint, the wisdom to know when to reveal their abilities and when to hide them. He taught them these lessons carefully. "Your minds are like weapons," he told them one evening in his office. "A weapon always visible invites attack. A weapon hidden can be used when the time is right." He leaned forward. "There'll be moments you must show what you can do. There'll be moments when showing will only bring harm. You must learn to recognize the difference." The twins listened closely. They'd already begun learning through experience, seeing how their intelligence had destroyed their mother's life in Marblehead, how white people reacted when confronted with black minds exceeding their own. They practiced hiding in plain sight, giving answers correct but not too correct, displaying knowledge impressive but not threatening, reading white reactions and adjusting behavior accordingly. It was exhausting, degrading, necessary. Meanwhile, the war continued. In January 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all slaves in Confederate states free. News spread through Philadelphia's black community like wildfire. People celebrated in the streets. Churches held Thanksgiving services. For the first time, the federal government declared slavery wrong. But celebration tempered with reality. The proclamation only freed slaves in rebellious states, not border states in the Union. It didn't grant citizenship, voting rights, or end the war. Fighting continued through 1863 and into 1864, battles growing larger and more terrible: Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Chickamauga, names synonymous with death on a scale Americans had never experienced. Elijah followed the war obsessively, collecting newspapers, mapping army positions, calculating casualties and supply logistics, predicting outcomes with remarkable accuracy. In March 1864, at age 10, he wrote a letter to Colonel Robert Goodshaw, commander of the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments in the Union Army. Unaware Shaw had been killed at the Battle of Fort Wagner in July 1863. Elijah sent the letter. It was returned with a note explaining Shaw's death. But someone had read it first and was impressed enough to share it. The letter contained Elijah's analysis: the Union would win, but only by cutting Confederate supply lines rather than capturing territory, using black soldiers more extensively for their motivation, and predicting the war would end sometime in 1865 if these strategies were followed. The letter reached a Boston newspaper editor who'd known Shaw. He published it under the headline, "A Child's Wisdom on the War," noting it was written by a 10-year-old black boy at the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. Once again, the Carter twins were in newspapers, and once again, trouble followed. In April 1864, a group of 5 white men in expensive suits with Southern accents came to the Institute. They claimed to be businessmen from Maryland, a border state where slavery remained legal, who'd heard about the remarkable Negro children and wanted to see them. Mr. Bassett met them at the door. He didn't like what he saw. They had the look of slave catchers, men who hunted escaped slaves for profit. "The children you're asking about aren't escaped slaves," Bassett said. "They were born free in Massachusetts, here legally under my protection with full support of this institution." The leader, a tall man with a gray beard and cold eyes, smiled without warmth. "We're not suggesting otherwise. We simply wish to meet them. Surely a brief visit would cause no harm." Bassett stood firm. "The children aren't available for visits. They're students here. Their education is my responsibility, and I don't believe your interest is academic." The men exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them. "Very well," the leader said. "Perhaps we'll return another time." They left, but Bassett knew they'd be back. That night, he called Elijah and Ruth to his office. "Do you know who those men were?" he asked. The twins exchanged a look. Ruth spoke first. "They weren't businessmen. They looked at us the way buyers look at merchandise. They want something from us, something specific." Elijah nodded. "They were lying about being from Maryland. Their accents were wrong. One slipped a phrase common in South Carolina, not Maryland. I think they were from further south." Bassett wasn't surprised. He'd learned to trust their perceptions. "I think they may try to take you. I don't know for certain, but I believe they see you as valuable property. Children with minds like yours would be worth a lot to certain people, scientists who want to study you, circus owners who want to display you, or worse." He paused. "I'm sending you somewhere safe. There's a community in Ohio near Oberlin. It's an abolitionist stronghold. The college there has admitted black students for decades, and there's a network protecting escaped slaves and free black people in danger. You'll be safe there." The twins didn't argue. They understood the danger. Their minds, which should have been their greatest asset, had become a liability in a world not ready to accept black intelligence. 2 days later, they boarded a train heading west. They didn't know they wouldn't return to Philadelphia for many years, wouldn't see Mr. Bassett again, and that the men in expensive suits wouldn't stop looking for them. The journey to Ohio took 4 days. The twins traveled with a woman named Harriet Tubman, not the famous Harriet who'd led hundreds of slaves to freedom, but another who used the same name, a common practice among the Freedom Network, providing cover and confusion. She was 40, with strong hands and watchful eyes. She didn't speak much during the journey. She watched, listened, made sure no one followed them. They traveled by train when safe, by wagon when not, staying in houses with signs indicating safe harbor for black travelers, eating meals prepared by strangers who asked no questions. On the 3rd night, in a farmhouse in western Pennsylvania, the woman called Harriet sat with the twins and told them things they needed to know. "You're being hunted," she said, "not just by those men who came to your school. There are others who have heard about your abilities and want to use you for their own purposes." She looked at them with eyes that had seen too much. "Some want to study you. They think your minds can teach them about race and intelligence. They want to cut you open, look at your brains, measure your skulls and organs. They don't see you as children, but as specimens." Ruth felt a chill. She'd known people looked at her differently, but not that some wanted to dissect her. "Others want to display you. put you on stages, charge money for people to see the Negro children who can think. They'd dress you up, teach you tricks, parade you like trained animals, make themselves rich. Elijah clenched his fists. He'd always known his mind was different, but not that it could be bought and sold like cotton or tobacco. And there are some, Harriet continued, her voice dropping, who want to destroy you. They believe your existence threatens everything they hold dear. If people see what you can do, if they believe black minds can equal white minds, the whole system of slavery and segregation collapses. They'd rather see you dead than prove them wrong. She leaned forward and took their hands. This is the world you live in, the world you have to survive. I'm sorry. I wish I could promise it'll get better, but I can't. All I can promise is there are people who will help you. People who believe in freedom, who will fight for you even when you can't fight for yourselves. She released them and stood. Tomorrow we reach Ohio. You'll be safe there. But remember what I've told you. Never forget you're hunted. Never stop running. The twins didn't sleep that night. They lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything Harriet said, their mother alone in Marblehead, not knowing if they were safe. Mr. Bassett, who'd protected them and sent them away to protect them further. The men in expensive suits who wanted to take them, and the future. The long, uncertain, dangerous road ahead. They were 10 years old, already having lived through more than most people experienced in a lifetime. They understood in a way no child should that their lives would never be easy, their gifts never fully appreciated, their minds always seen as anomalies, exceptions, impossibilities. But they also understood something else. They had each other, born together, grown together, developed their extraordinary abilities together. Their minds worked differently together than apart. They could communicate without words, solve problems by dividing perspectives, protect each other in ways no one else could. This was their secret, not intelligence, memory, calculation, or reading, but their bond. And as long as they had that bond, they'd survive. Oberlin, Ohio, was unlike anywhere Elijah and Ruth had ever seen. The town had been founded in 1833 by Presbyterian ministers who believed racial equality was a Christian duty. From its earliest days, Oberlin had welcomed black residents, black students, and escaped slaves seeking freedom. The college at the town's center had been the first in America to regularly admit black students and women alongside white men. By 1864, when the Carter twins arrived, Oberlin had become the most racially integrated community in the United States. The twins were placed with a family named Langston. John Mercer Langston was a black lawyer educated at Oberlin College, who had risen to become one of the most prominent black leaders in Ohio. His wife, Caroline, was a teacher who ran a small school for black children in their home. They had 3 children of their own, and they welcomed Elijah and Ruth as if they were family. For the first time since leaving Marblehead, the twins felt something close to safety, but safety, they would learn, was always temporary. The first months in Oberlin were focused on education. The twins were enrolled at the preparatory department of Oberlin College, where students as young as 10 could begin studies that would eventually lead to college admission. The curriculum was rigorous, designed to prepare students for the same education that white students received at Harvard or Yale. For most students, this curriculum was challenging. For Elijah and Ruth, it was not challenging enough. Within weeks, their teachers recognized what Dr. Warren and Mr. Bassett had recognized before them. These children were not ordinary students. Their minds operated on a different level entirely. They absorbed information at a rate that seemed impossible. They made connections between subjects that their teachers had never considered. They asked questions that revealed understanding far beyond their years. The head of the preparatory department, a stern New England woman named Professor Mary Jane Patterson, called the twins to her office after their first month of classes. Professor Patterson was herself a remarkable person. She had been born free in North Carolina and had moved to Ohio as a child. In 1862, she had become the first black woman in American history to earn a bachelor's degree, graduating from Oberlin College with honors. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to be a black person with an exceptional mind in a world that did not want to acknowledge black excellence. She sat behind her desk and studied the twins with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Your teachers have reported to me about your progress," she said. "They are astonished. They have never encountered students like you. They do not know what to do with you." The twins sat quietly, waiting for her to continue. "I have seen your examination results," Professor Patterson continued. "You have mastered material that is designed for students twice your age. You have done this in a matter of weeks. If you continue at this pace, you will exhaust our entire curriculum within a year or two." She leaned forward, her expression serious. "This creates a problem," she said. "Not for you, for us. We do not have the resources to educate minds like yours. We do not have teachers who can challenge you sufficiently. We do not have textbooks advanced enough to hold your interest." Ruth spoke first. "What do you suggest we do?" Professor Patterson smiled slightly. It was a rare expression on her stern face. "I suggest that we stop treating you as students," she said. "I suggest that we start treating you as colleagues." This was an unusual arrangement, perhaps unprecedented, but Professor Patterson had the authority to implement it, and she did. Beginning in their second month at Oberlin, Elijah and Ruth were no longer simply students. They attended classes when they chose to, but they were also given access to the college library, where they could pursue whatever subjects interested them. They were invited to attend lectures meant for college students. They were encouraged to conduct their own research and to share their findings with faculty members who were working on similar questions. Elijah gravitated toward mathematics and military strategy. He spent hours in the library reading about the campaigns of Napoleon, the tactics of ancient generals, the principles of logistics and supply. He applied his mathematical mind to the problems of warfare, developing theories about optimal troop movements and resource allocation that his professors found remarkable. Ruth gravitated toward languages and history. She taught herself Greek and Hebrew, in addition to the Latin she had begun to learn. She read primary sources in their original languages, discovering nuances that translations had missed. She developed a particular interest in the history of slavery, tracing its roots back through ancient civilizations, understanding how human bondage had evolved over millennia. Together, they began to see the world in ways that most people never would. But even in Oberlin, even surrounded by people who supported them, the twins could not escape the reality of their situation. The men who had come to Philadelphia did not give up their search. In March of 1865, 3 months before the end of the Civil War, a stranger arrived in Oberlin asking questions. He was a white man in his 40s, well-dressed, with a polished manner that suggested education and wealth. He said his name was Dr. Samuel Morton, and that he was a scientist from Philadelphia conducting research on human intelligence. He said he had heard about 2 exceptional Negro children who were studying at Oberlin, and he wished to meet them for academic purposes. Dr. Morton was not who he claimed to be, the real doctor. Samuel Morton had been a physician in Philadelphia who had spent decades collecting human skulls and measuring them to prove that white people had larger brains than black people. His work had been used to justify slavery and racial discrimination. He had died in 1851, 14 years before this stranger arrived in Oberlin claiming his name. John Mercer Langston was the first to recognize the deception. As a lawyer, he had learned to research people who made claims, and he discovered quickly that Dr. Samuel Morton was dead. He confronted the stranger at his hotel. "I do not know who you are," Langston said. "But I know who you are not. You are not Dr. Morton. Dr. Morton died 14 years ago, and I know what you want. You want the Carter children. You will not have them." The stranger's polished manner disappeared. His face twisted into something ugly. "Those children are valuable," he said. "More valuable than you can imagine. There are people who will pay a great deal of money for minds like theirs, and there are other people who will pay a great deal of money to make sure minds like theirs are never seen again." He stepped closer to Langston, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You cannot protect them forever," he said. "Sooner or later they will leave Oberlin. Sooner or later they will be vulnerable, and when that happens we will be waiting." He turned and walked away, leaving Langston standing in the hotel lobby with a cold fear in his heart. That night, Langston gathered the twins and told them everything. He did not soften the truth or try to protect them from the danger. He believed they deserved to know what they faced. Ruth listened with a calm expression that masked her churning emotions. "Who are these people?" she asked. "Who is paying them?" Langston shook his head. "I do not know for certain, but I have suspicions. There are wealthy men in the South who have made fortunes from slavery. The war is going badly for them. They know they are going to lose. They know that slavery will end, and they are looking for ways to prove that even without chains, black people will remain inferior." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Children like you are a threat to that belief," he said. "If you exist, if you can do what you do, then everything they believe is wrong. Some of them want to study you to find some explanation that preserves their world view. Others want to destroy you before you can prove them wrong." Elijah had been silent throughout this conversation. Now he spoke, his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "What can we do?" he asked. Langston looked at him with respect. This child, this 11-year-old boy, was asking not how to hide, but how to fight. "For now you can continue your studies," Langston said. "You can continue to develop your minds. Knowledge is power, and the more you know, the more powerful you become. But you must also be careful. You must not draw unnecessary attention to yourselves. And you must be ready to move at a moment's notice if the danger becomes too great." The twins nodded. They understood. They had been running since they were 8 years old. They would continue to run for as long as necessary. But someday they knew running would not be enough. Someday they would have to stand and fight. The Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The news reached Oberlin 3 days later. Church bells rang throughout the town. People poured into the streets, celebrating, weeping, embracing strangers. After 4 years of bloodshed, after more than 600,000 deaths, the war was finally over. The Union had been preserved. Slavery had been destroyed, but the celebration was short-lived. 5 days after Lee's surrender, on April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He died the following morning without regaining consciousness. The news of Lincoln's death cast a shadow over everything. The man who had guided the nation through its darkest hour, who had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, who had promised to bind up the nation's wounds, was gone. In his place stood Andrew Johnson, a man from Tennessee whose commitment to black equality was uncertain at best. Ruth understood immediately what Lincoln's death meant for people like her and Elijah. She was 11 years old now, and her understanding of history and politics had grown sophisticated. She had studied the patterns of power throughout human civilization. She had seen how progress could be reversed, how freedom could be taken away, how the powerful always found ways to maintain their dominance. "Lincoln was the only thing protecting us," she said to Elijah on the night they learned of the assassination. "Without him, everything changes." Elijah had been thinking the same thing. His study of military strategy had taught him that winning a war was only the beginning. Holding the peace was often harder than winning the victory. "The people who hunted us before will be stronger now," he said. "They will have allies in the government. They will have time to rebuild their power, and they will not forget about us." He was right. The years following the war, known as Reconstruction, were a time of hope and horror for Black Americans. On one hand, Congress passed constitutional amendments that formally abolished slavery, granted citizenship to black people, and guaranteed voting rights regardless of race. Black men were elected to Congress. Black communities built schools and churches. For a brief moment, it seemed like true equality might be possible. On the other hand, violence against black people increased dramatically. White supremacist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan emerged across the South, terrorizing black families and murdering black leaders. Laws were passed to restrict black freedom in everything but name. The promise of Reconstruction was betrayed almost as soon as it was made. Elijah and Ruth watched these developments with growing concern. They were teenagers now, their minds sharper than ever, their understanding of the world deeper than most adults would ever achieve. And they understood that the fight for black equality was far from over. It had barely begun. In 1868, when the twins were 14 years old, they made a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. They decided to use their gifts in service of their people. The decision came after a long conversation with John Mercer Langston, who had become like a father to them. Langston had recently been appointed as the first dean of the law department at Howard University in Washington, D.C. He was preparing to move his family to the nation's capital, and he wanted the twins to come with him. Howard University had been founded in 1867 to provide higher education for black Americans. It was named after General Oliver Otis Howard, who had led the Freedmen's Bureau and had committed his life to helping formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. The university was small and underfunded, but it represented something important, a commitment to black intellectual development at the highest level. Langston believed that the twins belonged at Howard, not as students but as teachers. "You have learned everything Oberlin can teach you," he said. "You have read more books than most professors. Your minds are ready for work that matters, and Howard needs people like you." Ruth hesitated. She was only 14. How could she teach adults who were twice her age? Langston smiled. He had anticipated this objection. "You will not teach classes in the traditional sense," he said. "You will work as researchers. You will help faculty members with their projects. You will write papers that will be published under other names. Your contributions will be hidden, but they will be real." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "This is how power works," he said. "Not through public recognition, but through quiet influence. You will shape the thinking of the people who shape the world. You will plant seeds that will grow into forests, and no one will ever know that the seeds came from you." The twins understood what he was offering. It was not fame or glory. It was something more valuable. It was purpose. They agreed to go to Washington, but before they left Oberlin, they received news that changed everything. Their mother was dying. Sarah Carter had never recovered from the loss of her children. After they left Marblehead, she had descended into poverty and despair. The white community that had shunned her continued to shun her. The few black families in the area did what they could to help, but resources were limited. She had developed consumption, the disease that would later be called tuberculosis. By the time word reached Oberlin, she had been sick for months. The doctors said she had weeks to live, perhaps less. The twins faced an impossible choice. Going to Marblehead meant exposing themselves to the people who had been hunting them for years. The men who wanted to capture them, study them, or destroy them were still out there. Returning to Massachusetts would put them in danger. But their mother was dying. She was alone. She had sacrificed everything for them. Could they let her die without seeing her one last time? They did not hesitate. They boarded a train heading east. The journey to Marblehead took 3 days. The twins traveled under assumed names, wearing plain clothes that made them look like ordinary black children. They avoided eye contact with white passengers. They spoke as little as possible. They made themselves invisible. But invisibility has limits. On the second day of the journey, as the train passed through Pennsylvania, Elijah noticed a man watching them from across the car. The man was white, middle-aged, with the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. He wore the clothes of a farmer or laborer, but his eyes were too sharp, too calculating. He was not what he appeared to be. Elijah leaned close to Ruth and whispered without moving his lips. "We are being watched," the man in the brown coat by the window. Ruth did not turn her head. She had already noticed the man. She had been tracking his movements since he boarded the train at the last station. "I know," she whispered back. "There is another one at the front of the car. They are working together." Elijah's mind raced through possibilities. They could get off at the next station, but that would only delay the confrontation. They could try to hide in the crowd, but there was no crowd on this rural stretch of railroad. They could fight, but they were two teenagers against grown men, probably armed. "The train is slowing down," Ruth said. "We will reach a station in approximately 3 minutes. When the doors open, we run." Elijah nodded almost imperceptibly. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan they had. The next 3 minutes felt like hours. The train decelerated gradually, the landscape outside the windows changing from forest to farmland to the outskirts of a small town. The man in the brown coat stood up casually and began moving toward the twins' end of the car. The man at the front did the same. They were closing in. The train stopped. The doors opened. Elijah and Ruth exploded into motion. They had always been fast runners, their young bodies lean and strong from years of activity. They burst through the door and onto the platform, weaving through the crowd of passengers waiting to board. Behind them, they heard shouts of surprise and anger as the two men tried to follow. The twins did not look back. They ran through the station, past the ticket counter, out onto the main street of the town. They had no idea where they were. They had no idea where to go. They simply ran. A hand reached out and grabbed Ruth's arm. She spun around, ready to fight, ready to scream. But the hand belonged to a black woman. She was old, perhaps 60, with gray hair and kind eyes. She wore the simple dress of a domestic servant, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "This way," the woman said, "quickly before they see you." There was no time to question. The twins followed the woman down an alley, through a gate, into a small yard behind a house. The woman opened a cellar door and gestured for them to descend. They climbed down into darkness. The door closed above them. They heard the woman's footsteps moving away. For a long time there was only silence. Then, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the cellar door opened again. The old woman climbed down carrying a lantern. "You are safe for now," she said. "Those men searched the station, but they did not find you. They have boarded another train heading further east. They think you are still running." Ruth found her voice. "Who are you? How did you know to help us?" The woman smiled. "My name is Patience. I work for the family that owns this house, and I knew to help you because I was told to watch for 2 children who might need protection. A message came last week from a man named Langston. He said you might be passing through. He said to keep you safe." The twins looked at each other. Even from Ohio, John Mercer Langston was protecting them. He had anticipated the danger. He had arranged help along their route. They were not alone. They spent 2 days hiding in Patience's cellar. She brought them food and water, news and information. She told them that the men who had been following them were still in the area, asking questions, offering rewards for information about 2 black children traveling together. But she also told them something else. She told them that their mother was still alive. Sarah Carter had defied the doctor's predictions. She was clinging to life, refusing to die until she saw her children one more time. She knew they were coming. She had felt it somehow, in the way that mothers sometimes feel things they cannot explain. On the 3rd day, Patience arranged for a wagon to take the twins the final miles to Marblehead. They traveled at night, hidden under blankets in the back of the wagon. The driver was a black man who asked no questions and offered no conversation. They arrived at their mother's house just before dawn. The house was smaller than Ruth remembered. The paint was peeling. The windows were cracked. The garden that their mother had once kept so carefully was overgrown with weeds. But the door was open, and a candle was burning in the window. They went inside. Sarah Carter lay on a narrow bed in the corner of the main room. She was thin, terribly thin. Her skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too prominent. Her hair had gone gray. Her eyes were closed, but when she heard her children's footsteps, those eyes opened, And despite everything, despite the illness and the poverty and the years of separation, she smiled. "You came," she whispered. "I knew you would come." The twins knelt beside her bed. They took her hands, one on each side. And for the first time in 6 years, they were a family again. Sarah lived for 3 more days. In those 3 days, she told her children everything she had never been able to tell them before. She told them about her own childhood, about her parents, about the history of their family stretching back generations. She told them about the father they had never known, a sailor who had died at sea before they were born. She told them about the night they were born, how she had held them in her arms and known immediately that they were special. And she told them what she wanted them to do with their lives. "Do not hide," she said, her voice weak but clear. "I told you to hide when you were children. I told you to pretend to be ordinary. I was trying to protect you, but I was wrong." She gripped their hands with surprising strength. "You cannot hide what you are," she said. "You cannot pretend to be less than you are. The world will always try to make you smaller, to put you in boxes, to tell you what you cannot do. But you must not listen. You must stand tall. You must let them see what you are. You must show them what black people can become when they are given the chance." She took a shuddering breath. "I will not see it," she said. "I will not see what you will become. But I know it will be magnificent. I know you will change the world. And I know that somewhere, somehow, I will be watching." She died on the morning of the 4th day with her children holding her hands. They buried her in a small cemetery on the outskirts of Marblehead. The grave was unmarked. There was no minister, no ceremony, no one present except the twins and the undertaker, who had agreed to help. But as they stood by the grave, Ruth spoke words that their mother would have wanted to hear. "We will not hide," Ruth said. "We will not pretend. We will show the world what you always knew we could be, and we will make you proud." Elijah added his own promise. "We will fight," he said. "Not with weapons, not with violence, but with our minds. We will prove that everything they believe about us is wrong. We will tear down their lies with truth, and we will never, ever give up." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then they turned and walked away from the grave, away from Marblehead, away from the life they had known as children. They were 14 years old, they were orphans, and they were ready to change the world. The twins arrived in Washington, D.C. in the autumn of 1868. The nation's capital was a city of contradictions. The great buildings of government stood alongside neighborhoods of desperate poverty. White politicians debated the future of black Americans in marble chambers, while black families struggled to survive just blocks away. Freedom had been declared, but equality remained a distant dream. Howard University was located on a hill overlooking the city. The campus was small, just a few buildings surrounded by muddy fields, but what it lacked in physical grandeur, it made up for in ambition. The twins began their work immediately. They were officially enrolled as students, but this was a formality. In reality, they worked alongside the faculty, contributing to research projects that would shape the future of black education. Elijah focused on mathematics and economics, developing theories about how black communities could build wealth despite systemic discrimination. Ruth focused on history and law, documenting the crimes of slavery and building legal arguments for reparations and equal rights. Their contributions were hidden, as Langston had promised. Papers were published under the names of professors. Speeches were delivered by others. The twins remained in the shadows, their influence invisible but powerful. But shadows can only hide so much. In 1871, when the twins were 17, Ruth wrote a legal brief that argued for federal protection of black voting rights. The brief was technically authored by a Howard professor, but the arguments were entirely Ruth's. The brief was used by Republican members of Congress to support what became known as the Enforcement Acts, a series of laws designed to combat the Ku Klux Klan and protect black voters in the South. The laws passed, the Klan was temporarily suppressed. Black men voted in record numbers in the elections of 1872. But someone noticed. a journalist from a southern newspaper, had been investigating the origins of the legal arguments used to pass the Enforcement Acts. He traced the brief back to Howard University. He discovered that the credited author, the professor, had not actually written the document. He dug deeper, and he found the twins. The article appeared in December of 1872 under the headline, "Negro Children Control Congress." The story was sensationalized, exaggerated, and filled with racist assumptions, but at its core was a true revelation. Two black teenagers had been secretly shaping federal policy for years. Their minds had produced work that changed laws and influenced elections. Their intelligence had penetrated the highest levels of government. The reaction was immediate and violent. Congress launched an investigation. Howard University was threatened with loss of federal funding. Death threats flooded in from across the country. A group of men attempted to set fire to the building where the twins lived, but something else happened too. Black newspapers across the country celebrated the twins as heroes. Churches read their names from pulpits. Parents told their children about Elijah and Ruth Carter, the proof that black minds were equal to any minds on earth. The twins became symbols of everything that black Americans could achieve if given the chance. They had spent their entire lives hiding. Now finally they stepped into the light. In January of 1873, Elijah and Ruth Carter gave their first public speech at the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. The church was packed. People stood in the aisles, sat on windowsills, crowded outside trying to hear through the open doors. The twins walked to the front of the sanctuary and looked out at the sea of black faces, waiting to hear what they had to say. Ruth spoke first. "They told us we could not think," she said. "They told us our minds were inferior. They told us that slavery was justified because we were less than human. They told us these things because they wanted to believe them, because believing them made it easier to do evil." She paused, letting her words settle. "We are the proof that they were wrong, not because we are special, not because we are different from other black people. We are the proof because we were given a chance to learn, a chance to develop our minds, a chance to become what we were always capable of becoming." She gestured to the crowd. "Every person in this room has the same capacity. Every black child in America has the same potential. The only difference is opportunity, and that is what we must fight for. Not just freedom, not just equality under the law, but opportunity, the chance for every black child to discover what their mind can do." Elijah spoke next. "Our mother told us something before she died," he said. "She told us not to hide. She told us to let the world see what we are. She told us that the world will always try to make us smaller, but we must not listen." He looked out at the faces watching him, faces filled with hope and pain and determination. "We have been fighting this battle for our entire lives," he said. "We will continue fighting it for as long as we live, but we cannot fight alone. Every one of you is a soldier in this war. Every one of you has a mind that can be sharpened, a voice that can be raised, a contribution that can be made." He raised his fist. "They want us to be silent. They want us to be invisible. They want us to accept our place at the bottom of society. But we will not be silent. We will not be invisible. We will not accept what they tell us we must accept." His voice rose to fill the church. "We are Elijah and Ruth Carter. We are black. We are gifted. And we are just the beginning." The church erupted in cheers. People wept openly. Strangers embraced each other. For a moment in that sacred space, the dream of equality felt possible. The twins stood together, holding hands as their mother had held theirs on her deathbed. They had come so far, from a small fishing village in Massachusetts, through fear and flight and loss, through years of hiding and years of work, to this moment, standing before their people, claiming their place in history. But their story was not over. It was just beginning. The following decades were filled with both triumph and tragedy. Elijah Carter became one of the most influential economists of his generation. He developed theories about wealth creation in oppressed communities, that would not be fully appreciated until more than a century after his death. He advised black business owners, trained black accountants, and established investment funds that helped black families build generational wealth despite the obstacles placed in their way. Ruth Carter became a legal scholar whose work laid the groundwork for civil rights arguments that would eventually reach the Supreme Court. She trained dozens of black lawyers. She wrote briefs that challenged segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement. She never argued a case in court herself. Women were not permitted to do so, but her words were spoken by others in courtrooms across the country. Together, they founded schools, established newspapers, and built organizations that would continue their work long after they were gone. But they also faced defeats. Reconstruction ended in 1877, and with it ended the federal commitment to protecting black rights. The Ku Klux Klan resurged, Jim Crow laws spread across the South. The progress that had been made was systematically dismantled. The men who had hunted the twins never stopped hunting them. Over the years, there were assassination attempts, arson, threats against everyone they loved. They learned to live with danger as a constant companion, and there were personal losses. John Mercer Langston died in 1897. Leaving a void that could never be filled. Friends and colleagues passed away. The community that had nurtured them grew smaller year by year. But they never stopped fighting. In 1910, when the twins were 56 years old, they gave their final public speech together at the inaugural conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP had been founded just a year earlier, building on the work that people like the Carters had been doing for decades. Ruth was frail now, her health damaged by years of relentless work. Elijah stood beside her, his hair white but his eyes still sharp. "We have lived long enough to see great changes," Ruth said, her voice weaker but still clear. "When we were born, slavery was the law of the land. When we die, we will leave behind a generation that has known nothing but freedom. That is progress." She paused to catch her breath. "But we have also lived long enough to see how easily progress can be reversed, how quickly freedom can be taken away, how persistent hatred can be." She looked out at the young faces in the audience, faces that would carry the struggle forward. "Do not be discouraged," she said. "Do not despair. The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. You may not live to see the victory. We will not live to see the victory, but the victory will come. It must come, because truth is stronger than lies, and love is stronger than hate." Elijah spoke last. "Our mother told us when we were children that we must show the world what black people can become when they are given the chance. We have tried to do that. We have succeeded in some ways and failed in others, but we have never stopped trying." He took his sister's hand. "Now the work passes to you. You must continue what we started. You must build on what we built. You must never give up, never surrender, never accept the world as it is when it could be so much better." He looked at the audience one final time. "We are Elijah and Ruth Carter. We were told that our minds were impossible. We proved that nothing is impossible, and we pass that lesson to you now and forever. Nothing is impossible." Ruth died 3 months later, in the spring of 1910. Elijah followed her in the autumn of that same year. They were buried side by side in a cemetery in Washington, D.C., not far from the campus of Howard University. Their headstone bore a simple inscription: "Two minds, one purpose, freedom." The story of the Carter twins faded from popular memory in the decades that followed. History books focused on other figures, other moments. Their contributions were absorbed into the larger narrative of the civil rights struggle, their individual names forgotten. But their legacy lived on. Every black child who received an education, every black lawyer who argued for justice, every black economist who built wealth for their community, every black family that rose from poverty through education and hard work. All of them were beneficiaries of what the Carter twins had started. And somewhere in the archives of Howard University, there are boxes of papers that have never been fully examined. Letters and documents that bear the handwriting of two children who should not have been able to write what they wrote. Evidence of minds that should not have existed according to the beliefs of their time. The twins' story proves something that should never have needed proving. It proves that intelligence is not determined by race, that potential is not limited by circumstance, that the human mind, given the chance to develop, can achieve things that seem impossible. It proves that two children born in poverty, hunted by hatred, orphaned by injustice, can still change the world. And it proves that the world, despite all evidence to the contrary, can change, not quickly, not easily, not without cost, but it can change. That is the lesson of Elijah and Ruth Carter. That is their gift to us. That is the secret they carried, the impossible secret that could not be explained. The secret was hope. The secret was resilience. The secret was love. And that secret, unlike the twins themselves, can never die. It lives on in every person who refuses to accept limits, in every child who dares to dream, in every mind that reaches for something greater than what the world says is possible. The Carter twins lit a flame in 1862. That flame still burns today, and it will keep burning as long as there are people willing to tend it, as long as there are people willing to believe.